The grand palace of Sephora Prime glittered like a jewel against the violet sky, its crystalline spires reaching toward the three moons that hung above the imperial capital. Inside the celestial hall, Empress Valoris Talmarin sat upon the eternal throne, her silver eyes coolly assessing the latest suitor to approach her. The Archduke of Centauri presents the tribute of 7 quantum-locked stars, preserved at the moment of their birth, announced the imperial herald, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. Valoris didn't bother hiding her yawn. The Archduke, a four-armed humanoid with scales that shifted color with his emotions, currently displayed a hopeful shade of amber as he gestured to the containment field hovering beside him. Inside, tiny pinpricks of impossibly bright light twisted in suspended animation. "How original," she said, her melodic voice carrying the slightest edge of sarcasm. "Tell me, Archduke, did you acquire these yourself, or did you merely purchase them from the Andromeda Enclave?" The amber scales immediately flushed crimson with embarrassment. That is, my acquisition teams." "You may leave the tribute," Valoris said, waving a 6-fingered hand dismissively. "The palace scientist will find some use for them, I'm sure." As the Archduke backed away in humiliation, First Minister Kalbax leaned toward the Empress's throne. His crested head dipped respectfully before he whispered, "My Empress, that marks the 17th suitor you've rejected this cycle alone. The noble houses grow concerned about succession." Valoris turned to him, her luminescent skin pulsing faintly with irritation. "When I find someone worthy of sharing the eternal throne, the Empire will know. Until then, I rule alone." Kalbax suppressed a sigh. At 327 years old, Valoris was approaching the midpoint of a Sephoran life cycle, still young for an empress, but increasingly mature. The Empire had weathered 5 years of her independent rule since the death of her father, but tradition demanded an imperial consort. "The final audience of the day," announced the herald. "The Earth Alliance diplomatic delegation." Valoris straightened slightly. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel barely 40 years ago. Their ambassador to Sephora had requested this audience to negotiate expanded trading rights, hardly a matter requiring imperial attention, but Valoris had been curious enough to grant it. 5 humans entered the hall, looking small and fragile compared to the towering Sephorans and other species. Their leader, a woman in formal blue attire, stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Ambassador Talia Reeves of Earth, your luminescence, we are honored by your audience." Valoris nodded slightly. "Sephora welcomes Earth's representatives." As the ambassador launched into prepared remarks about mutual prosperity, Valoris found her attention drifting to the 4 humans standing behind Reeves. 3 wore similar diplomatic attire, but the 4th was different, a tall man with broad shoulders and watchful eyes that scanned the room continuously. Unlike his companions, who stared in wonder at the opulence around them, he seemed focused on the people, noting positions and movements. Security advisor, Valoris guessed. Interesting that they'd bring one to a formal audience. After granting provisional approval for expanded trade negotiations, Valoris rose, signaling the end of court. "Tonight, a feast will be held in honor of our interstellar guests," she announced, a traditional gesture of imperial hospitality. Captain Elias Drake felt decidedly out of place in the gleaming banquet hall. The ceremonial formal wear that the diplomatic corps had insisted he wear chafed at his neck, and he longed for the comfortable utility of his old military uniform. "Stop fidgeting," Ambassador Reeves murmured beside him. "You're here as security advisor, not to make friends." "Hard to provide security in this getup," Elias replied quietly, tugging at his collar. "And they've confiscated all my equipment." "Sephorans consider weapons at an imperial feast the highest insult," Reeves reminded him. "Just observe and advise, that's all." Elias nodded, his eyes continuing their methodical sweep of the hall. The space was magnificent, vaulted ceilings that seemed to capture starlight, tables laden with exotic foods, and hundreds of attendees from across the galaxy. At the head table, Empress Valoris sat surrounded by her ministers, her silver skin luminous under the ambient light. Despite himself, Elias found his gaze returning to her repeatedly. There was something compelling about her, not just her alien beauty, but the sense of isolation that surrounded her like a force field. Even in a room full of courtiers, she seemed utterly alone. "The human stares," said Minister Kalbax in Sephoran, not realizing Elias had spent months learning the basics of their language. "Humans always stare," Valorous replied, sipping from a crystal chalice. "Their species is driven by curiosity." As servants brought the seventh course of the meal, Elias noticed a server approaching the imperial table with a covered dish. Something in the server's gait caught his attention, too direct, too purposeful compared to the fluid grace of the others. The server placed the dish before the Empress and removed the cover. As vapor rose from the plate, Elias caught a flicker of movement, the server's sleeve shifting, revealing something metallic. Instinct took over. Elias vaulted over the table in front of him, shouting a warning that was lost in the ambient noise. The server's hand emerged with a crystalline blade, arcing toward the Empress's exposed neck. Time seemed to slow. Elias launched himself between the assassin and Valorous, feeling the burning slice of the blade across his shoulder instead of the Empress's throat. His momentum carried them both to the floor as Imperial guards rushed forward. The last thing Elias saw before chaos erupted was the Empress's silver eyes, wide with shock, staring directly into his. For that single moment, she wasn't the untouchable ruler of 1,000 worlds. She was simply a woman confronting her own mortality. Then pain washed over him, and darkness followed. Consciousness returned to Elias in waves, each bringing sharper pain from his shoulder. He opened his eyes to find himself in a chamber unlike any hospital room he'd ever seen. Prismatic light filtered through crystalline walls, casting rainbow patterns across a bed that seemed to float above the floor. Medical devices he couldn't identify hummed softly nearby. "The human awakens," said a voice. Elias turned his head to see a Sephiran physician approaching, her six-fingered hands manipulating a holographic display. "How long?" Elias asked, his voice rough. 38 standard hours, the physician replied. "The blade carried a neurotoxin specific to your biology. Fortunate that we had human medical data in our systems." Elias attempted to sit up, wincing as pain lanced through his shoulder. "The Empress." "Unharmed, thanks to your intervention." The new voice came from the doorway where First Minister Kalbax stood, his crest folded in what Elias recognized as a gesture of respect. A surprising act from a human. "Not surprising to humans," Elias replied dryly. Kalbax approached the bed. "The Eternal Empress wishes to see you when you are able. I have been instructed to bring you to her private chambers once the physician clears you." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Private chambers, is that normal?" "It is unprecedented," Kalbax admitted, his tone revealing his discomfort. "As is much about this situation." 3 hours later, after being cleared by the physician and provided with clean clothing in a human style, Elias followed Kalbax through the labyrinthine palace corridors. They passed through security checkpoints where guards with crystalline armor regarded Elias with obvious suspicion. Finally, they arrived at an ornate doorway flanked by elite guards. Kalbax placed his palm against a scanner. "The human goes no further without full security protocols," said one guard, stepping forward. "The Empress has waived standard protocols," Kalbax replied, though he seemed no happier about it than the guard. The doors slid open silently, revealing a vast chamber that appeared to open directly into space. Elias gasped before realizing it was an advanced projection. The stars and nebulae surrounding them were too perfect, too choreographed. In the center of the room, Empress Valorous stood before a floating display of data, her back to the door. She wore simpler attire than during the formal audience, a fitted silver tunic that emphasized her tall, lithe form. "Captain Drake," she said without turning, "approach." Elias stepped forward, feeling Kalbax's reluctance to leave them alone. The doors closed behind him. "You knew my rank," Elias observed. "You've been researching me." Valorous turned then, her silver eyes studying him intensely. "You took a blade meant for me. I wish to understand why." "Instinct," Elias said with a shrug that pulled painfully at his wound. "I saw the threat and reacted." "Your instinct contradicts established xenopsychological models of human behavior," Valorous said, circling him slowly. "Self-preservation should have taken precedence." Elias smiled slightly. "Your models need updating." For a moment, he thought he saw the faintest flicker of amusement cross her alien features. "Perhaps," she conceded. "Nevertheless, I find myself in your debt, Captain Drake." "No debt necessary, your luminescence." Valoris, she corrected, stopping directly before him. When we are alone, you may use my name. The statement hung in the air between them, its significance clear to both. Such familiarity with the Empress was unheard of. Then I'm Ilias, he replied simply. Valoris nodded, then gestured to the data display. The assassination attempt was sophisticated. The toxin on the blade would have killed me instantly, designed specifically for Sephiran biology. Just as the second toxin was designed for human biology, Ilias noted. They were prepared for interference. Yes, Valoris's luminescent skin pulsed briefly with what Ilias recognized as concern, which suggests foreknowledge of your presence and role. A security leak in your palace, Ilias surmised, or in our delegation. My security director believes the conspiracy extends to the noble houses, Valoris said, her voice hardening. Those who wish to see me wed to a candidate of their choosing, or eliminated if I refuse. Ilias studied the data displayed before them, personnel files, security logs, communication records. You're conducting your own investigation. I trust few at present, Valoris admitted. Which brings me to my proposal, Ilias Drake. I wish to appoint you as my personal security advisor during this crisis. Ilias blinked in surprise. Me? Wouldn't your people object to an outsider in such a position? Vehemently, Valoris said with what might have been a smile. Which is precisely why you are ideal. You have no connections to Sephiran politics, no allegiance to any house but your own species, and you have already proven willing to risk your life for mine. Ambassador Reeves won't be pleased, Ilias warned. I'm meant to return with the delegation next week. I have already spoken with your ambassador, Valoris replied. She was reluctantly accommodating to an imperial request. Ilias considered the offer. His military career had ended 2 years ago after a disagreement with command over an operation that had cost civilian lives. The diplomatic security role had been a second chance, a way to still serve Earth's interests. But this was something else entirely. What exactly would my duties entail? He asked. You would remain at my side, Valoris said, at all times. The implications of her statement weren't lost on him. That close to you, I'd be a target too. Yes, she acknowledged. Hence why only someone who has already demonstrated willingness to take a blade for me would be suitable. Ilias found himself studying her face, trying to read beyond the alien features to the person beneath. For all her power and the centuries she had lived, he sensed vulnerability there, and something else. Curiosity, interest. I accept, he said finally. Though I should warn you, humans are notoriously stubborn. I won't simply obey without question. That, Valoris said, is precisely what I'm counting on, Ilias Drake. As if to seal their arrangement, she extended her 6-fingered hand. After a moment's hesitation, Ilias took it in his own. Her skin was smoother than human skin, slightly cooler, and seemed to pulse faintly with inner light where they touched. Neither immediately pulled away, both suddenly aware of the strangeness and the unexpected rightness of their contact. Your security briefing begins now, Valoris said softly. There is much you need to know about those who wish me dead. Outside the Empress's chambers, unbeknownst to either of them, First Minister Kalbax was engaged in an encrypted communication. The human remains close to her, he reported quietly. Your prediction was correct. Then we proceed to the next phase, replied a distorted voice. The eternal throne must not be tainted by human blood. 2 weeks into his new role, Ilias had adjusted to the rhythm of imperial life. His days revolved around Valoris, accompanying her to council meetings, standing guard during diplomatic functions, reviewing security protocols with her personal guard. The initial resentment from the Sephiran security forces had shifted to grudging acceptance after Ilias had detected and neutralized a surveillance device hidden in the Empress's chambers. Today, they walked together through the Imperial Arboretum, a vast biodome housing plant species from across the Empire. Here, away from the formal constraints of the court, Valoris seemed different, more relaxed, her movements less measured. She had dismissed her regular attendants, leaving only Ilias at her side. Your recovery progresses well, Valoris observed, gesturing to his shoulder as they paused beside a pool where luminescent aquatic plants floated. Human bodies heal quickly, Ilias replied. One of our few advantages. You underestimate your species, she said, reaching out to touch a floating bloom. I have been studying Earth's history. Your adaptability is remarkable. Elias smiled. Is that a compliment from the eternal Empress? An observation, she corrected, though the faint pulsing of her skin betrayed amusement. Over their time together, Elias had learned to read these subtle changes in her bioluminescence, signals that most non-Sephorans missed. The noble houses are growing more vocal about your decision to keep me close, Elias said, changing the subject. I've received 7 formal protests in the last 3 days. 12 have reached me directly, Valorous replied calmly. House Tavari has threatened to withdraw from the Defense Council. Elias frowned. That's a significant escalation. Perhaps we should reconsider. No, Valorous turned to face him, her silver eyes intense. Their objections are not truly about security protocols or diplomatic concerns. They object to you, Elias Drake. Because I'm human. Because you are becoming important to me, she corrected, her directness catching him off guard. And that threatens those who wish to control the throne through marriage alliances. Elias felt his pulse quicken. They had been circling this unspoken thing between them for days, the lingering glances, the conversations that stretched late into the night, the growing comfort in each other's presence. Valorous, he said, using her name deliberately, whatever is happening between us, it can't proceed. You know that. Why? She challenged, stepping closer. Because our species evolved on different worlds, because my lifespan will extend centuries beyond yours, or because you fear the political implications. All of those reasons are valid, Elias replied, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor despite her proximity. I'm not a suitable consort for an empress. I have no royal lineage, no political power. You saved my life, Valorous said softly. That gives you a claim few can match. Before Elias could respond, his communication device chimed, an urgent alert from the security team. He checked the message and immediately tensed. We need to return to the palace, he said, now. The emergency council session was already underway when they arrived. Minister Kalbax presided over a table of agitated nobles and officials, all speaking over one another until Valorous entered the chamber. Explain, she commanded, taking her place at the head of the table. Admiral Thrix, commander of the Imperial Fleet, activated a holographic display. Surveillance satellites detected unauthorized activity at the outer moon base, he reported. When security forces investigated, they discovered this. The hologram showed footage of a communications array, modified with unfamiliar technology. Human technology, declared Lord Vantes of House Tavari, glaring at Elias. Earth Alliance equipment transmitting encrypted data directly to human space. Elias stepped forward to examine the display. That's not Alliance standard, he said. The configuration is wrong. Convenient denial, sneered Vantes. While you've been whispering in our Empress's ear, your people have been spying on Imperial defenses. These accusations are unfounded, Valorous said coldly. Captain Drake has my complete confidence. Does he have more than that, Empress? Asked Lady Mezar, her voice silky with insinuation. The court speaks of little else these days, how the human rarely leaves your side, even during private hours. The chamber fell silent, the accusation hanging in the air. Elias felt dozens of eyes upon him, hostility radiating from the gathered nobles. You forget yourself, Lady Mezar, Valorous said, her skin pulsing with barely controlled anger. My private associations are not subject to noble scrutiny. They are when they threaten imperial security, countered Vantes. We demand the human be removed from your presence and detained until a full investigation can be conducted. You demand nothing of your Empress, Valorous replied, rising to her feet. The air in the chamber seemed to crackle with tension as her bioluminescence intensified, a display of imperial authority that made several nobles step back. Elias touched her arm gently, a breach of protocol that caused audible gasps. Valorous, he said quietly, perhaps I should withdraw temporarily. Give your security forces time to investigate properly. Her eyes met his, a silent communication passing between them. Then she nodded slightly. Captain Drake will relocate to the diplomatic wing, she announced. But he remains under my protection and continues his advisory role. This council is dismissed. As the nobles filed out, many casting suspicious glances at Elias, Kalbax approached them. A wise compromise, Empress, he said. It will calm the houses temporarily. It is no compromise, Valorous replied. It is a tactical repositioning. Intensify the investigation. I want to know who placed that equipment and why. Later, as Elias prepared to move his belongings to the diplomatic wing, Valorous visited his quarters. The guards outside looked uncomfortable at her presence, but dared not object. This separation is temporary, she told him once they were alone. I will not allow them to dictate my choices. Elias sighed, setting down the few personal items he'd brought from Earth. Valorous, we need to be realistic. The noble houses will never accept me in any capacity beyond security advisor, certainly not as your consort, she finished when he hesitated. Is that so unthinkable to you, Elias Drake? No, he admitted, his voice low. That's what terrifies me. It's not unthinkable at all. She moved closer until only inches separated them. In 3 centuries, I have never met anyone of any species who interested me as you do, who challenged me, protected me, saw me as more than the eternal throne. Elias felt the last of his resistance crumbling. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his hand to her face, his fingers tracing the delicate luminescent patterns on her cheek. Her skin pulsed brighter at his touch. This could start a political crisis, he warned, even as he leaned closer. It already has, she whispered. Their lips met, human and Sephoran, warm against cool, familiar yet alien. The kiss deepened as centuries of imperial protocol shattered between them. Neither noticed the hidden surveillance drone in the corner of the room, transmitting the intimate moment to those who would use it against them both. The hollow projection of Elias and Valorous embracing played before the assembled noble council, their intimate moment now a public spectacle. Lord Vanties's expression was triumphant as he gestured dramatically toward the image. This abomination cannot stand, he declared. The eternal throne tainted by human touch. Valorous sat rigidly on her ceremonial chair, her face an impassive mask despite the violation of her privacy. Beside her, separated by guards, Elias fought to contain his fury. The imperial bedchamber has always been beyond the scrutiny of the houses, said Minister Kalbax, though his tone lacked conviction. This surveillance constitutes treason. A necessary measure given the circumstances, countered Lady Mezar. The evidence confirms our worst fears. The human has seduced our Empress, clouding her judgment when our empire faces unprecedented threats. Valorous raised a hand, and the chamber fell silent. Her skin pulsed with controlled anger as she rose to address the council. You speak of tradition while violating its most sacred tenets, she said, her voice glacial. You claim to protect the empire while undermining its sovereign. The only threat I see comes from within these walls. The law is clear, Empress, said Vanties, unperturbed. Any who seek the imperial consort position must prove themselves worthy through the trials of ascension. Tradition cannot be discarded simply because you have developed feelings for this creature. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Even Valorous's supporters looked troubled by the public evidence of her relationship with Elias. I have made no formal claim to the consort position, Elias stated, stepping forward despite the guards' attempts to restrain him. This deliberate invasion of the Empress's privacy serves only to distract from the real conspiracy, the assassination attempt, and the illegal surveillance equipment discovered on the outer moon. Convenient deflection, sneered Vanties. But the law remains. If you wish to remain at our Empress's side in any capacity, you must face the trials. And if I refuse, Elias asked. Then you will be removed from Imperial space immediately, said Admiral Thrix, who had remained silent until now. For the stability of the Empire. Valorous's eyes met Elias across the chamber, a silent communication born of their weeks together. He saw the conflict there, the struggle between her personal desires and her duty to the millennia-old institutions she represented. I accept the trials, Elias announced before Valorous could speak. Shock rippled through the chamber. No human had ever undertaken the trials of ascension. Few non-Sephorans had even attempted them, and none had survived. Elias, no, Valorous said, her composure cracking slightly. The trials were designed for Sephoran physiology. Then they'll need to be adapted, Elias replied firmly, unless your noble traditions can't accommodate that basic fairness. Admiral Thrix stepped forward. Adaptation would defeat the purpose human. The trials test worthiness through suffering and endurance. They cannot be diluted. Then I'll face them as they are, Elias said. Vantes smiled coldly. The Council accepts your challenge. The trials begin at dawn tomorrow. I suggest you prepare yourself, human. Few have survived even the first challenge. As the Council dispersed, Valoris ordered the guards to leave them alone. Once the chamber emptied, she approached Elias, her luminescence dimmed with concern. You cannot do this, she said urgently. The trials will kill you. Do I have a choice? Elias asked quietly. They've backed us into a corner, Valoris. If I leave, they win. If I stay without proving myself, they'll use our relationship to undermine you. There must be another way, she insisted, her cool fingers gripping his arms with surprising strength. Elias shook his head. We both know there isn't. Whatever conspiracy is moving against you, it's accelerating. This is their attempt to remove me from the equation. Because they fear what we've discovered, Valoris said. The communication array, the assassination attempt, they're connected, and someone on the Council is involved. All the more reason for me to face the trials, Elias replied. It buys us time to identify the conspirators. Valoris's fingers traced the contours of his face, as if memorizing him. The first trial is the Void Walk, she said softly. Designed to test mental resilience against the psychic currents of slipspace. Few non-Sephorans can withstand it. Then I'll be the first, Elias promised. Dawn brought Elias to the ancient trial grounds beneath the palace, a vast chamber of black stone and crystalline formations. The noble council observed from elevated platforms, while Valoris sat apart on a throne of luminescent material, her formal regalia making her seem more alien than ever. The trial of the Void Walk begins, intoned the ritual master, an ancient Sephoran whose crest had long since calcified with age. Step into the chamber, challenger. A circular platform in the center of the room began to glow with swirling energies. Elias approached, dressed in the simple garment provided for challengers, a black bodysuit that left his arms and feet bare. The void will test your mind, the ritual master explained. It will find your deepest fears, your darkest memories, and use them against you. Endure for one standard hour, and you will proceed to the next trial. Elias stepped onto the platform. Immediately, the energy field intensified, encasing him in a shimmering bubble. He heard Valoris catch her breath as his body became transparent, revealing the neural pathways in his brain glowing with increasing intensity. Then the pain began, not physical, but a psychic assault that tore through his mental defenses. Elias gasped as memories flooded his consciousness. The civilian massacre he'd failed to prevent during his military service, the death of his younger brother in a shuttle accident, the crushing loneliness of deep space deployment. The void magnified each trauma, making him relive it in excruciating detail. He fell to his knees, hands clutching his head. Through wavering vision, he saw Vantes smiling coldly, while Valoris gripped the arms of her throne, her skin pulsing with distress. Time stretched impossibly as the assault continued. Elias felt his consciousness fragmenting, his sense of self dissolving under the relentless pressure. This was how the trial killed, not by physical damage, but by shattering the mind beyond repair. In his darkest moment, as he felt himself slipping away, Elias focused on a single thought: Valoris. Not the Empress, but the woman who had revealed herself to him in private moments, curious, passionate, surprisingly vulnerable beneath her imperial facade. He clung to those memories, using them as an anchor against the void's assault. The hour passed with agonizing slowness. When the energy field finally dissipated, Elias collapsed onto the platform, trembling uncontrollably. The chamber fell silent as the observers waited to see if his mind had survived intact. Slowly, painfully, Elias pushed himself to his feet. Blood trickled from his nose and ears, but his eyes were clear as he faced the council. The challenger survives the first trial, announced the ritual master, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Prepare for the trial of elemental endurance. What followed tested the limits of human physiology. For 6 brutal hours, Elias endured extremes of temperature, pressure, and atmospheric composition that pushed his body to the breaking point. Unlike Sephorans, who could regulate their internal environment through their bioluminescent systems, Elias had only his determination and Earth-standard human resilience. By the final trial, the combat gauntlet, Elias was already weakened almost beyond recovery. Still, he faced a series of increasingly formidable opponents, relying on military training and human unpredictability to compensate for his depleted strength. His final opponent was a cybernetically enhanced gladiator from the outer colonies, towering over Elias with 4 articulated arms, each ending in a different weapon. "Yield," the creature offered as they circled each other. "There is no dishonor in recognizing superior force." "Can't do that," Elias gasped, blood seeping from countless wounds. "Too stubborn, human trait." The battle that followed was brutal and desperate. Elias no longer fought for protocol or politics. He fought for survival, for Valorous, for the chance to uncover the conspiracy threatening them both. Each blow he landed cost him, each hit he took brought him closer to collapse, but he refused to yield. When his opponent finally fell, Elias stood swaying in the center of the arena, barely conscious. The assembled nobles stared in disbelief at the bloodied human who had accomplished the impossible. "The trials are complete," declared the ritual master. "The challenger has proven worthy." As darkness claimed him, Elias saw Valorous rushing toward him, protocol forgotten in her concern. Her last words reached him before consciousness faded. "Hold on, my love, hold on." The healing chambers of the Imperial Medical Wing hummed with energy as specialized equipment worked to repair Elias' battered body. 3 days had passed since the trials, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, catching glimpses of medical staff, and occasionally Valorous herself seated beside his bed. On the 4th day, Elias finally awakened fully, blinking against the soft, ambient light. His body ached, but the searing pain had subsided to a manageable discomfort. "The human resilience continues to surprise our medical team," said a familiar voice. Elias turned his head to find Valorous watching him from a chair beside his bed. She wore simple attire rather than imperial regalia, and they were alone in the chamber. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. 4 days, 6 hours, she replied precisely. "You suffered injuries that would have killed most species." Elias attempted to sit up, wincing as his muscles protested. Valorous moved to assist him, her cool hands surprisingly gentle. "The council?" he asked once he was upright. "In disarray," Valorous said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. "Your survival of the trials has disrupted their plans considerably." Elias studied her face, noting the subtle signs of exhaustion in her dimmed luminescence. "You've barely left this room, have you?" "I am Empress. I go where I wish," she replied, but her slight smile confirmed his suspicion. "What about the conspiracy?" Elias asked. "Have we made progress while I've been indisposed?" Valoris's expression hardened. "Indeed, Admiral Thrix has been most cooperative since his encrypted communications with House Tavari were discovered. It seems they plan to install Lord Vantes as imperial consort, by force if necessary, creating a puppet administration answerable to the military council." "And the assassination attempt?" "A contingency plan," Valorous explained. "If I could not be controlled, I would be eliminated and replaced by a more malleable relative from a cadet branch of my lineage." Elias absorbed this information, a cold anger building within him. "Vantes." "Under guard awaiting trial for high treason," she replied, "as are his co-conspirators." Silence fell between them, broken only by the soft hum of medical equipment. Despite the resolution of the immediate threat, something remained unresolved, the question of what would happen now between them. "The noble houses are demanding a decision," Valorous said finally, addressing the unspoken issue. "Your completion of the trials has qualified you as a potential consort, but many still oppose the idea of a human in such a position." "And what do you want?" Elias asked quietly. Valorous's silver eyes met his. "I want what I have never had in 3 centuries of life, Elias Drake, freedom to choose based on my heart rather than imperial necessity." She took his hand, her 6 fingers intertwining with his 5 in a physical representation of their differences and their complementary fit. "But I am also Empress," she continued. "My decisions affect billions across thousands of worlds. I cannot simply follow personal desire." Elias felt a heaviness settle in his chest. "You're saying goodbye." "No," Valorous corrected. "I'm saying we have one more battle to face, perhaps the most difficult one yet." 2 weeks later, fully recovered, Elias stood beside Valorous in the great assembly hall. Every noble house, planetary governor, and military commander in the empire had been summoned to witness the Empress's historic announcement. Valorous, resplendent in full imperial regalia, surveyed the gathered dignitaries with regal composure. At her nod, Minister Kalbach stepped forward to address the assembly. Her luminescence, Eternal Empress Valorous Talmarin, sovereign of the Thousand Suns, will now address the empire. Valorous rose, and the vast hall fell into absolute silence. For 5 years I have ruled alone, she began, her voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the chamber. In that time, our borders have remained secure, our economy has prospered, and our influence has expanded. Yet many among you have expressed concern about succession, about tradition, about the future of our dynasty. Her gaze swept across the assembly, lingering on those who had most vocally opposed her. Recent events have revealed weaknesses in our imperial structure, vulnerabilities that nearly cost us our sovereignty to those who would place their ambition above the empire's welfare. These events have also revealed unexpected strengths, particularly in our relationship with humanity. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Valorous gestured for Elias to stand. Captain Elias, Drake of Earth, has proven himself by the ancient laws of our empire. He has endured the trials that many thought impossible for a human. He has saved my life at risk of his own, and he has helped uncover a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of imperial rule. She turned to face Elias directly. Our species evolved on different worlds under different suns. Our biologies are distinct, our lifespans unequal. Yet in him, I have found qualities that transcend these differences, courage, integrity, and perspective that our empire desperately needs as we face an ever-changing galaxy. Valorous extended her hand, and Elias took it without hesitation, facing the assembly alongside her. I hereby declare my intention to take Elias Drake as my imperial consort, she announced. Not despite his humanity, but because of it. The strength of our empire has always come from adaptation, from incorporating the best of what we encounter across the stars. This union will be the embodiment of that principle. The hall erupted into chaos, shouts of outrage mingling with expressions of support. Valorous allowed it to continue for several moments before raising her hand for silence. I do not make this decision lightly, nor do I make it solely from personal inclination. The biological differences between our species mean that this union cannot produce heirs in the traditional manner. She activated a holographic display showing genetic sequences. Our scientists have been exploring alternatives, ways to combine Sephoran and human genetic material through advanced techniques. But even if such methods prove impossible, adoption of suitable heirs remains an imperial tradition older than many of your houses. This is unprecedented, shouted Lord Ravik of House Morath. The imperial bloodline has remained pure for 10,000 years. And where has that purity led us? Countered Valorous. To stagnation, to vulnerability, to noble houses plotting against their own empress because they cannot imagine change. She stepped forward, her bioluminescence intensifying with emotion. Look beyond our borders. Other interstellar powers adapt and evolve while we cling to traditions born in a simpler age. The Arachnid Collective incorporates beneficial traits from conquered species. The Terrillian Republic embraces diversity in its leadership. Even humanity, barely a century into its galactic presence, shows remarkable flexibility in its alliances and governance. Elias watched as her words began to sway some of the undecided faces in the crowd. I do not ask you to abandon our traditions, Valorous continued, her voice softening. I ask you to honor their spirit rather than their letter. Our ancestors built this empire by recognizing strength wherever they found it, by bringing the best of the galaxy under Sephoran rule. This union honors that legacy. A tense silence fell over the assembly as the nobles and officials processed her words. Finally, to everyone's surprise, Admiral Thrick stepped forward from where he stood under guard. As one who conspired against you, Empress, who believed a human consort would weaken us, I must speak. His crest lowered in submission. I was wrong. The human's actions during the crisis, his survival of the trials, and his focus on the Empire's welfare rather than personal gain have demonstrated qualities worthy of the throne. This unexpected endorsement from a former enemy shifted the mood in the chamber. Other voices rose in support, though significant opposition remained. A formal vote will be held, Valorous announced. But know this, my decision is made. I am your Empress by right and by tradition. This union will proceed with your blessing or without it. Later that night, in the privacy of the imperial chambers, Valorous and Elias finally found a moment alone together. She had dismissed her attendants, and they stood on the balcony overlooking the capital city, its crystalline towers glittering beneath the three moons. That was quite a performance, Elias said, placing his hands on her shoulders. I'm not sure whether they were more shocked by your choice or by your willingness to proceed regardless of their approval. Valorous turned in his embrace. Both, I imagine. The Sephoran nobility has grown too accustomed to an empress who accommodates their expectations. And now they have one who defies them, Elias observed. That will take adjustment. As will this, Valorous said, her fingers tracing the contours of his face. We have much to learn about each other, Elias Drake, our physiologies, our cultural differences, our expectations. I've been studying, Elias admitted with a slight smile. Imperial consort duties, Sephoran anatomy, interspecies relations. Interspecies relations? Valorous echoed, amusement pulsing through her luminescence. How clinical. The official texts are, Elias agreed, but I'm more interested in practical application. Their lips met, the sensation now familiar yet still exhilarating. What had begun as experimental curiosity between them had deepened into something more profound, a connection that bridged the vast differences of their origins. As the kiss deepened, Elias felt the distinctive vibration of Valoris's skin intensifying under his touch. He had learned that Sephoran arousal manifested through heightened bioluminescence, patterns of light that pulsed across her silver skin in ways unique to each individual. Your research appears thorough, Valorous murmured against his lips, her hands exploring the unfamiliar contours of human musculature beneath his clothing. Not nearly thorough enough, Elias replied, guiding her toward the imperial bed. There's still so much to discover. They undressed each other slowly, each movement a revelation of alien anatomy, his tanned skin against her luminescent silver, the differences in their forms creating new possibilities for pleasure. Valorous guided his hands to the sensitive nodes along her spine where her bioluminescence originated, showing him how the right pressure could send waves of sensation throughout her body. In turn, Elias introduced her to human erogenous zones, teaching her how the slightest touch could provoke intense responses. Their lovemaking was both tender and exploratory, punctuated by moments of discovery and occasional laughter at unexpected reactions. When they finally joined completely, finding a rhythm that accommodated their physiological differences, the room filled with the pulsing light of Valoris's pleasure, a visual symphony that matched Elias' more vocal expressions. In that moment of connection, the politics and conspiracies that had brought them together seemed distant and inconsequential. They were simply two beings from distant worlds who had found something rare and precious across the vast gulfs of space: understanding, acceptance, and love. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the strange intimacy of their differences, Valorous traced the scars from Elias' trials that marked his body. These will fade with continued treatment, she said softly. I'd prefer to keep them, Elias replied. They're a reminder of what we've faced together. Valorous studied him in the dim light, her silver eyes reflective. The noble houses will continue to resist. There will be other conspiracies, other challenges. I'm counting on it, Elias said with a smile. Humans thrive on adversity, it's what we do best. Then you have chosen the right Empress, Valorous replied, her luminescence pulsing with affection. For I have no intention of making our reign a peaceful one. The Empire has been comfortable for too long. To discomfort, then, Elias said, pulling her closer, and to new dynasties. As the three moons of Sephora Prime continued their eternal dance across the alien sky, the unlikely couple, human and Sephoran, soldier and empress, began writing a new chapter in the history of the galaxy. Their union would face challenges unimagined, their differences would create complications unforeseen, but in the fusion of their strengths, a transformation had begun that would eventually reshape an empire.